and welcome to The Language of Power, a podcast brought to you by the European Policy Centre's Europe in the World programme. Every 2 weeks we bring you insight on the latest geopolitical developments, how they affect Europe, and how Europe can affect them. I'm Paul Taylor, Senior Visiting Fellow at the EPC, and I'll be your host on these deep dives into global and European politics and security. Today we're going to look at France's proposal to extend its nuclear deterrent to protect European partners at a time of increasing uncertainty over whether the United States would come to the aid of NATO allies in case of war in Europe. In a landmark speech delivered theatrically in a cavernous naval base with a nuclear submarine as the backdrop, President Emmanuel Macron announced in March a new departure in French nuclear policy known as advanced nuclear deterrence. Going beyond his predecessor's past statements that France's vital interests went beyond its borders, he said Paris would begin consultations with a group of partners, including Germany, Poland, Sweden, and Greece, on how they could cooperate with France in nuclear deterrence. The carefully prepared initiative was followed by synchronized announcements in Berlin, Warsaw, and elsewhere, confirming that talks on nuclear strategy were underway. Cooperation would include joint work on air defense, deep conventional strike weapons, space-based intelligence, and early warning. Macron and his European peers stressed that this was complementary to US and NATO nuclear protection and not intended to replace them. However, the timing, shortly after President Donald Trump had threatened to seize Greenland from Denmark and question NATO's Article 5 mutual defense clause, suggested that the Europeans are urgently seeking an extra layer of deterrence in case the American umbrella doesn't open in a crisis. Macron said the French president would retain sole control over the decision to use nuclear weapons, but that French nuclear-capable aircraft might be deployed in partner countries. How far Paris, with its 290 warheads on 4 submarines and 2 squadrons of air-launched cruise missiles, can provide a credible deterrent against thousands of Russian nuclear weapons, including battlefield missiles and medium-range strikes covering all of Europe, remains to be seen. French nuclear doctrine remains the nuclear arsenal is a weapon of last resort to be employed if France's vital interests are threatened. Paris would fire 1 nuclear warning shot before unleashing missiles from its submarines that could inflict unacceptable damage on Russia. That's very different from both Russian nuclear doctrine, which envisages escalation early in any conflict to warn the West against resisting, and to US doctrine, which since the 1960s has envisaged a flexible response with a ladder of nuclear escalation. So how credible is the French deterrent, even in conjunction with Britain's small submarine-based nuclear force? Would Vladimir Putin take a French nuclear threat seriously? Will France's European partners accept nuclear dependency on Paris as willingly as most of them accepted relying on Washington for nearly 8 decades? Does France need more missiles and possibly a land-based component to deter Russia? And how will it pay for them? To discuss these and other questions raised by President Macron's speech, I'm delighted to welcome Claude-France Arnould, Senior Fellow for European Defence at the Brussels Institute for Geopolitics and a former Director of the European Defence Agency and long-time EU security official, and my colleague Juraj Majcin, a policy analyst in the EPC's Europe in the World programme, who leads our defence and security project. Welcome to both of you. Claude-France, let me start with you. Tell us what's really new about President Macron's initiative. After all, several French presidents have said they consider Europe to be part of France's vital interests. And even Macron is not proposing to share decision-making on when to use the bomb. Why is it different this time?
Well, for me, the main difference and what is radically new is the interaction with the European partners. You mentioned the synchronization of reactions, and it means that cooperation is at work, and dialogue, and again interaction. In the past, France has very clearly stated that our nuclear capabilities also possesses a European dimension. Even General de Gaulle mentioned it, and since the Fifth Republic, it has been a constant position that the French vital interests, even if it's called French vital interests, have a European dimension. And then, for the first time, there is a positive, explicit reaction, and it's a start of a dialogue and of a cooperation. You mentioned the immediate declaration with Chancellor Merz. It's far from the first time that the French proposed to the Germans, for instance, that we would extend our nuclear capability. And the Germans always kept silent about it, a very impressive silence. And then now it's quite different. And it's different because of what you said, because of the strategic context, because of the increase of the Russian threat, which was rather acute in the 60s, but nevertheless it's acute again, and the doctrine is what you said. And because of the American position and the major uncertainty, then again, for me, what is really new is not the French offer per se, it is the interaction with the European states to which it is addressed, and what will follow on.
So at last they're all talking to each other about nuclear deterrence. That is indeed a first. But how can France offer a full-scale deterrent for Europe with its last resort doctrine that deliberately eschews the whole idea of a graduated nuclear response? How credible is it that a French president would commit its nuclear arsenal if Russia were, say, to fire a single tactical nuclear weapon somewhere on an Eastern European battlefield, thousands of kilometers from Paris?
Well, you're right to recall that the French deterrence is based on self-defense, protect vital interests, and now it's very clear that French vital interests have this European dimension. But at the heart of the French dissuasion, deterrence, there is the idea that a nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought. Then it's not a tactical weapon to fight, to have on European soil a nuclear battlefield, but it's the essence of deterrence that the damage that would be caused by a strike would be unacceptable for the adversary. Then it's, of course, it's a kind of gambit, and it's all about deterrence, that the price to be paid by the aggressor is not worth the damage, unacceptable damage it would convey. Then that is why the French doctrine has always been to have sufficient weapons. Then now, what does sufficient means? President Macron himself said that he would increase the number of warheads, doesn't want, of course, to specify the number of warheads. And he also confirmed the adaptation and the evolution of the capability. Then it's an adaptation because, of course, technology, particularly on the Russian side, has evolved. But it's not changing our position that we are ready to fight a nuclear war on the European soil. That's why the number of warheads is not determinant. And we never said, the French never said, what would be the targets, but it would be unacceptable.
Yeah, that makes sense from a French perspective, but if you're dealing with an adversary whose doctrine is to use nuclear weapons early in any conflict, the question is, are you really prepared to unleash Armageddon? Because after all, if you were to inflict unacceptable damage on Russia, one would assume that Russia has a second strike capability and is able to annihilate France. So how credible is it that you could actually stop Russia advancing on the battlefield by saying, watch out, we could go nuclear?
Well, firstly, I would just present facts and the reaction of Russia during the war in Ukraine. Russia has been hit by Ukrainian strikes, didn't react with a nuclear tactical weapon. There were moments where illegitimately, but as regard the doctrine, legitimately, Putin could have used the nuclear tactical weapon, and he did not. And I think that this kind of uncertainty about what would be the reaction, including of a French small capacity compared to the Russian capacity. Well, it could be St. Petersburg. It's always the example given. It's not a strike. The French, of course, is the reality of nuclear deterrence. You don't specify your target. But it would not be a target war using just military targets, because we have one shot. Well, we have the possibility to have the warning. We don't say that necessarily there will be, by the way, this warning signal. But once the submarines are in action, it's, as you say, Armageddon, at least for France, but also for the adversary.
Well, what role would allies who participate in the French advanced nuclear deterrence be expected to play? Would they host French nuclear bombers on their bases? Might France store nuclear warheads outside of its own territory in partner countries? Might some partners also be equipped to fire French nuclear cruise missiles, just as NATO's allies in Europe are involved in nuclear sharing and do so with the US nuclear bombs?
As I mentioned, what is really new and interesting in this offer, it is that it is a beginning of a cooperation. Then in Macron's speech and in the French position that prepared, because it was a very well prepared speech, and which follows on the basis of the reaction of the partners, it will really be a dialogue. That's why France didn't answer initially to all your questions. And the answer to all these questions will be on the basis of what the allies are ready to do. Then it begins with participation to French nuclear exercises, visit to strategic sites, then to understand exactly what is the French deterrence. And then second element, which is very important, is already cooperating about what Macron called l'épaulement, and I'm not sure about how it should be translated in English. I understand it cannot be shouldering.
I couldn't find an English translation for it either. It sort of means supporting, but it's not quite clear what that means.
But I think what he means, what the French means, is that it is a complementary capacity in cooperation. Then that means that the allies, which are not ready to go to the nuclear status for plenty of reasons that have been described in a very good paper, by the way, for the Munich conference, then what they can do is to complement the French nuclear capacity, and by the way, the French nuclear conventional forces around this nuclear capacity, by specific conventional capabilities, such as protection of the air domain, deep strike, and intelligence and space assets. Then they can cooperate on that. Now, for the specific question you asked, there will be nuclear steering groups with Germany and bilaterally with the other countries, and they will discuss all those questions. Do the partners want to have to host nuclear bombers? We have pros and cons. In which conditions are the French ready to do it? Do we store nuclear warheads? Do they want to have French nuclear warheads? And all that will be a dialogue with the partners. And as I said, and I think it's very important for the acceptability in France, on a bilateral basis and not in the NATO nuclear planning group.
Okay. Well, we know what all the questions are, but we don't have many answers yet, but lots to talk about, and finally a willingness to talk. Juraj, let me turn to you. How have France's NATO partners, including the US and the UK, responded to Macron's initiative, and what impact, if any, has it made in Moscow?
Yeah, I would just make sort of three observations on three categories or groups of allies of France. So first one is, of course, France's European allies at NATO that largely welcome the initiative. Of course, you mentioned the UK as a first example. And the UK as a nuclear power in its own right was the first partner that Paris approached, and that was a follow-up to earlier cooperation framework based on the Lancaster House treaties, and now we have the new Northwood Declaration, where the two European nuclear powers, France and the UK, commit to greater cooperation in nuclear affairs, especially nuclear deterrence, of course, and also in joint exercises. So it's a huge step forward for France and the UK, and here it has to be said that the UK's nuclear deterrent is dependent technically, on the technical side, on the US D5 Polaris missile. So it's not as independent as France's one. So that's why for UK it's also very important to work with France to get more independence from Washington. Then when it comes to France's continental allies, of course, Germany was the first partner. Claude-France already mentioned the bilateral nuclear steering group Berlin and Paris have established. The same is now happening with Sweden. And we expect similar frameworks to be adopted with Poland and other countries. In Poland is a particular example because they have sought for a very long time to host nuclear weapons owned by United States, the B-61 nuclear gravity bombs under U.S. nuclear sharing program. But U.S. has been very reluctant to provide this to Poland. So this is a very important step that France made there. And I think this is the way how France could repair mistakes from the past. And I'm going back to Jacques Chirac's quote of telling to their Eastern European allies of missing a moment to keep their mouths shut. So I think Macron has repaired it a bit with his Bratislava speech, and I think this is a very important step towards greater credibility of France on the eastern flank. Now, the US reaction was very interesting because although Elbridge Colby in particular pushes for this idea of NATO 3.0, which is you Europeans do more on the conventional side, will provide you with nuclear deterrence. So they welcome everything the Europeans do on the conventional side, but when it comes to debate on the nuclear side, Elbridge Colby himself was very skeptical about France and about France's ability to deter Russia, pointing to the limited number of warheads that France has, and also he reiterated that the United States is the ultimate guarantor of NATO's nuclear deterrence. This is also what France says that France says that we are not here to replace the US, we're just complementary to NATO. And I think it's because from the US perspective is the control, the escalation. Because if US does not provide nuclear guarantees for the US, then it will leave it all open for Europeans to do basically whatever they want. So US would lose control if Europe has more independent nuclear deterrence.
So it wasn't Elbridge Colby, as you mentioned, the Undersecretary of Defense, or now War, for policy, who seem to be the brains in the Pentagon at the moment, as opposed to simply the muscle. He was not very impressed with it. What about the Russians? How credible do you think France's nuclear deterrent is with its current doctrine and the size of its arsenal? Would Paris need to do more to enhance the credibility of its nuclear protection for partners?
So Russia has viewed historically France's nuclear deterrent as more, let's say, friendly towards Russia, because first it was not part of NATO's nuclear planning group, and also France used to have more cordial relations with Russia than, for instance, the United States or the UK. But as Claude-France has mentioned, what's different now is the European dimension. So it's the cooperation with the European allies, and especially those east of Paris, which is a strong signal to Russia. So Russia has to take it seriously. There was a statement by official Russian representatives saying that France's nuclear doctrine, or the extended nuclear posture, is a direct threat to Russia, and sort of classical Russian threatening way. They said that any French nuclear bomber stationed at any base east of Paris in any of these interested states would be a legitimate target for Russian nuclear forces. So I think Russia's perception will change, but still limitations of France's nuclear deterrent when it comes to the number of warheads and France's very specific doctrine of unacceptable damage present some technical limitations to what France can do. But Russia's perception is for sure changing.
The Russians obviously have all three vectors. They have submarine-based missiles, land-based missiles, very large number, and air-fired missiles. France only has a submarine-based and air-launched, and the UK only has submarine-based with no other vector. Do Europeans need some kind of land-based nuclear missile to fill a gap, as it were, in the deterrence ladder, Juraj?
Yeah, so of course here numbers really matter. And France has 290 warheads, most of them strategic. UK around 250 warheads, which pale in comparison to Russia's 1,500 strategic, and roughly the same number of tactical nuclear weapons. And even these, if you put them together, these 500 warheads, some may malfunction, some may be intercepted, some may miss their targets. So it's difficult for the UK and France to keep Russia at bay without the United States. Plus, we often ignore the tactical nuclear threat, something that Claude-France has already explained that France doesn't really see as a threat, because France sees as any nuclear attack by any power now against any European ally as a vital threat to France, which legitimizes and inflicting unacceptable damage to France's adversary, which I would describe as sort of a massive retaliation doctrine that NATO used to have in the 1950s when we came to flexible response. And the problem is that the scenario that NATO refers to as dosing, so use of nuclear weapons by Russia, so a limited tactical strike with a low-yield warhead against one of the eastern flank NATO members to deter any allied reaction by NATO. So in case we don't have the tactical nuclear weapons by the US, so this B-61 gravity bombs, for whatever reason available, then France's options, not mentioning UK's options, are very limited. So what should be done, I think, is not only increasing the numbers of warheads on both the UK and French side, but also coming up with a solution to this problem. So developing the lower yield tactical nuclear weapons. France used to have such weapons during the Cold War, ended with the Hades project in 1990s. That it doesn't have to be standalone weapon that is ground launched. Can be a submarine launched cruise missile. The United States is now working on project like that, or modification to the current French air launched cruise missiles. For instance, we know that they are modernizing it so that France has a hypersonic cruise missile by 1935. But solving this problem, keeping Russia at bay also on the tactical level, needs to be addressed, and France needs to develop means to do it.
Well, the last question to both of you. Obviously, there are a lot of politics in this. Might this be, and I've heard this in some European capitals, more of a power play within European politics at a time when France is politically weakened, domestic deadlock, fiscally constrained, and while Germany is rearming with the ambition to become the most powerful army in Europe, is the nuclear deterrent, as it were, France's last card in what may be a losing game in Brussels? And of course, political question, would this whole policy survive the election of a nationalist hard-right president in Paris next year, if that were to happen? Claude-France, let me start with you.
Well, I will begin saying that this offer, the offer that France made, again, what is new is the reaction of partners. What is not new, what is constant, is the fact that for decades, France said what Macron said. We are ready to extend our deterrent. There is a European dimension. Then it's not new. And it was done even when fiscally, politically, France was more comfortable than it is today, and Germany was more militarily modest than they are now. And rationally, the fact that Germany is increasing its capability and wants to become a major conventional army is a fundamentally positive element for deterrence. And everything that has been rightly said before, on the doubts on the European deterrence based on a French nuclear capacity, is to be considered in the light of the global European power. Then the efforts of the other member states are part of this power. And I wrote for the Brussels Institute for Geopolitics a small contribution saying that, in fact, Russia should be afraid of Europeans together. And it's not only because of the French and British nukes, but because of the conventional capability at large. Then this suspicion of beauty contest, of course, it's fun, but it's not serious, I think. But there is a game, or a challenge at least, I would say rather a challenge in Brussels. It's about cooperation with abundant money, a lot of money, and speed, the strategic pressure to go very quickly. Do we go separately or do we go together? And you cannot, in a way, separate nuclear capabilities and conventional capabilities for the reason we explained. Then it will be a success if we cooperate. And that is also very important to see what will be the German approach to the use of the money they are ready to spend. And then to see what we can do together with all those members we have mentioned today, Sweden, Poland, Germany, UK. Are we ready again to fight together? When your very easy question about the future president, I think it's also because of this perspective that Macron did, the speech he pronounced, and also because of that there was this kind of, what did you say, theatrical, the flag, the Marseillaise, the submarine, this wonderful and threatening place in L'Île in Brittany, in Bretagne. It's also to show that nationalism, la grande nation, as the Germans say, is also about that. And you have certainly noticed that there was no criticism. I had to write this paper for Big, then I was very vigilant to see what did the Rassemblement National, the National Rally, say. Nothing. Hardly nothing. Then I think that it would be very difficult, even for a very right-wing government, to change the position. Very, very difficult. And separating us from the European allies would undermine our nuclear capabilities and not only expose it more, as could have been said, but undermine if we don't cooperate with the European. And I think it would be very difficult for extreme right government.
Macron at least has made a preemptive nuclear strike against a possible future President Bardella. Juraj, any last thoughts from you on this?
I don't think this is France's last card. I think it was long overdue. It is a very good step by France towards extending European nuclear deterrence. Where I see a bit of a shortcoming is that France creates these bilateral steering groups with different countries, with Germany, with Poland, with the UK, but they don't create any sort of multilateral framework where they could trash out these issues together, like we have at the nuclear planning group at NATO. So I think to make this more credible and really more European, I think this should not be only bilateral, but maybe there should be some kind of multilateral framework for Europeans on nuclear deterrence that would be aligned with what's happening at the NPG as well. I think this would really add to the European umbrella on the French proposal.
Well, maybe he's left something for the next president to say in his big nuclear speech, or hers. Thank you very much to both. That's all we have time for this week, but you can read more on European defense issues, including 2 articles on nuclear deterrence by Juraj on our website, www.epc.eu, and you can find Claude-France's analysis of Macron's nuclear initiative on the Brussels Institute of Geopolitics website. The Language of Power will be back in 2 weeks' time, when we'll explore the budding relationship between Europe and India. Until then, thanks to my colleague Simona Lusuardi for helping to organize and record this podcast, and thanks to you for listening in.